Sixth webinar of the Sustainable Cities course. This week in the 8th module, we looked into SDGs, new forms of institutions, governance, public participation, democracy, and financing sustainable development. Today, we are joined by Professor Edgar Pieterse. Edgar is an urban scholar, writer, curator, and creative agent whose interests include the theory and practice of policy discourses and interventions to make African cities more just, open, and accessible. He holds a South African research chair in urban policy at the University of Cape Town and is director of the African Center for Cities. Formerly a special policy advisor to the Premier of Western Cape, he is the co-author of New Urban Worlds Inhabiting Dissonant Times and co-editor of Africa's Urban Revolution and Rogue Urbanism, Emergent African Cities. So we'll start the webinar by listening to Edgar for about 10 minutes. In the meantime, please write in your thoughts, comments, and questions in the chat box. So yeah, over to you, Edgar.
Thank you so much. And what a pleasure to be part of this webcast today. And I must confess, I feel like I'm being dragged into the 21st century by the scruff of my neck. This is my first form of interacting with students in this format. So, so I hope that this works out. But thank you again to the organizers for the opportunity. So I found the questions incredibly rich and provocative and quite challenging, actually. So I want to spend most of the time that we have together to work through those. But I guess in going through the lectures that form part of the MOOC and some of the issues that we were talking about, thinking through the questions, I thought I just wanted to draw your attention to maybe two more theoretical points that sit behind a lot of the discussion about democratization, SDGs, I guess, and how one brings them into the world and what the governance and institutional implications might be. So the first introductory remark is really sort of how do we think about urban politics? How do we think about the city and what is possible in terms of effecting, let's say, inclusive or human rights oriented change in the city? Now, it's important as people who work in ideas and who have some space to try and think systematically about things, to have tools to really do empirical work so that one can build a rigorous sort of, if you will, evidence-based conceptual understanding of what these dynamics are. So, of course, cities are immensely complex. There's numerous actors, different levels of power, etc. So this is a very difficult task. But one way to maybe think about this is that if we take any urban polity, that there are at least 5 domains of, if you will, decision-making, of ideas formation and action in the city. And the first one, the first two that I will refer to, one can broadly categorize as domains of action in the city that is top-down. In other words, they're in the realm of the state, they're in the realm of what government does. And the first of these would be the representative political forum. This is typically a local authority or some kind of urban agency that through either substantive or a minimal democratic process have been brought into being. And this is where public decision-making happens, where budgets get allocated, et cetera, et cetera. And typically this is where local government officials, local government officers, and the mayor and so forth are located. And of course, the visible point of political discourse would be the council meetings or the committee meetings and so on. And what we've seen in the last 20 to 30 years as participatory democracy has gained more and more ground around the world is that there's been a recognition that these fora in and of themselves are not adequate to represent the interests of everyone in the city. And so a whole slew of participatory mechanisms tend to be linked to these formal governmental processes. The second domain is what often is in evidence in societies where you've got highly organized formal institutions, for example, the trade unions, the social sectors, the public sector, and so forth. And they then are organized into a formally designed corporatist arena where, for example, strategic planning or spatial planning gets debated and the priorities of the city are determined. Now, of course, these are highly stylized because trade unions will always have a certain view on something. The business community will always push for more competitiveness, less red tape, and community groups will always say, we need more pro-poor investments and so forth. But they can be important, and often they're an important theater where agreements are reached before they go to the formal political arena. Now, not all cities have this. Sometimes these fora are informal as well. But there are a number of cities that has these in a more structured mechanism. So these are the two main top-down institutional arenas that if you want to effect change in the city, you have to take seriously. You've got to understand and you've got to engage in some form. Then if we turn to the other side of the spectrum and we think of bottom-up approaches, the one that usually comes to mind for people who believe in radical transformation of urban politics is, of course, the domain of social movements and direct social action. So this is very much the idea that you storm the Bastille, you're on the barricade, you are going to organize social movements to claim their rights and to argue for social justice in the city. And again, we see that this is often sporadic. We've seen in the last few years, especially in Southern Europe, as one example, a number of young people mobilizing because of the massive unemployment crisis that they faced in Spanish, Portuguese, Greek, and other European cities. And we've seen some of these places brought to a standstill. But these are not necessarily progressive. You also see reactionary social mobilizations and so forth. But the idea here is to think of direct action as a discrete domain of urban political practice. Then on the other hand, there is the work of what I call development practice. So this is the domain where people are mobilized in civil society to deal with early childhood development, urban food gardening, sanitation programs, self-help housing programs, collectives to deal with safety and public transport, and the list is endless. And of course, the idea is that citizens learn citizenship and a sense of belonging to a place or a community or a city by active participation in these various mechanisms that is a form of organization to achieve often very specific goals. And if the organization is democratic, if it is able to develop sound strategies, it is usually very effective in achieving its goal. But of course, because they often bring together large numbers of people who are seeking reforms, they also ripe often for political mobilization or capture by political parties in the city. And in the Asian context, we often see examples of vote banking or vote capturing happening through these large civil society organizations that are often welfarist in orientation. And then the final domain of urban politics is what I would call the domain of ideas, the domain of media, the domain of discourse production. And media, of course, especially now that we've got not just newspapers and television, but we've got a proliferation of social media platforms, this has become even more important in contemporary times to shape what urban discussions are about, to shape what is considered a priority, what is considered not to be priority, to often undermine actors in these other domains or to build them up. So to not understand the discursive domain or the domain of symbolic politics is to miss a fundamental aspect of how urban transformation happens. Now, the final point to make, and then we can go to the questions, is that in any city, if you just look at these domains on their own terms, you are missing the fundamental relational nature of cities and urban life and how urban politics operate. In other words, you will never fully understand either what the real drivers of urban processes are or what the potential for change might be unless you can unravel the relational connections between these domains. And this is, of course, why we need research, why we need documentation, why we need to analyze these things, and why we need concepts to make sense of these things. But it is also important to identify what the most strategic opportunities are to bring into the city or to bring into the political life of the city ideas such as the SDGs or SDG 11 or any of the SDGs that may have a very direct urban expression. So I sort of wanted to just refresh everyone around this conceptual framework because it's an important backdrop in terms of some of the responses that I will give to the specific questions. So on that note, let me pause, and then we can work our way through the questions that came through.
Thanks, Edgar. That was a wonderful introduction and completely set the context for our discussion today. So we already have our first question. So we'll take one from the discussion forum first. Aditi asked that in India, we have a lot of initiatives in housing and slum upgrading, which claim to be participatory, but then end up being consultative or placative, with reference to Einstein's participatory ladder. This is most likely to ensure speedy implementation. So how can policies to ingrain participation in projects?
Thanks. Yes, really rich question, and thanks, Aditi, for that. So I think that the first point that I wanted to make was that we have to recognize that there's always a balancing and eventual trade-off between process and delivery. This is inevitable in any development process. So of course, in an ideal world, you will have a really sound, carefully designed participatory process where diverse and conflicting interests are brought together, people are given enough support, and there's an enabling environment to surface difference, and there's a really carefully reasoned process of deliberation that then leads to a set of conclusions about what is the best way forward. And then those same actors are involved in thinking through the implementation mechanisms and maybe even being part of the implementation. However, as your question implies, in the real world, that is very difficult because often there's enormous political pressure to deliver, to get things done quickly. And in a context where there's massive needs, of course, the pressure is to deliver at scale and to do that very quickly. So the first issue to recognize, one, is that there is no perfect balance between process and implementation. There will always be a trade-off. The critical issue, though, is to make that trade-off explicit and that everyone involved in the process understands what are the consequences of the trade-off that has been decided on. So for me, the keywords here is transparency and accountability. So if there's a process and time is highly truncated and very few stakeholders have been involved, at least, at a minimum, insist on a completely open source process so that everyone has an opportunity to understand how decisions were arrived at and how planning was conducted. The second issue with regard to slum upgrading process itself is that it is not just about the design, but of course, what we now know from that literature is that, and a lot of the writing in this field, is that the actual process of upgrading in and of itself is in fact the moment where participation can be the most productive. One, because of course it makes it financially a little bit more viable. But secondly, if people are directly in their communities and stakeholders are directly invested in the upgrading process, there's a much higher likelihood that the long-term maintenance and further upgrading of that investment is taken care of because people have a direct vested interest. They don't see it as something that was imposed upon them from outside. So the last point to make on that, though, is that when we look at upgrading processes, a lot of the more technocratic agendas will be focused on the individual structures. But in fact, what we now know from literature and different case studies is that the more the participatory processes try and understand the relationship between individual structures and the neighborhood or the community and how that community will function in terms of not just the dwelling, but also public infrastructure and other infrastructures, the more likelihood, if those connections are understood and discussed, you will have a better outcome and a more impactful upgrading process.
Okay, thanks for that, Edgar. So next we have a question from a live chat. It's a rather emotive question, but still talks about the rising inequality in cities. So Munir here asks, how is radical transformation possible when neglected urban poor are incapable of raising their voice since they're busy fighting for their daily bread and butter?
Yes, thanks for that. So of course, there are many things going on with regard to the issue of inequality. So what we know is that inequality is a function of intra-urban dynamics. In other words, how the labor market in the city is structured, how the economy works, how land markets work, and so forth. And it is important that those drivers of inequality is understood. But we also know that there's a larger political economy at play. In other words, for developing countries like India or South Africa that I'm more familiar with and so forth, they have to always try and understand how the economy plugs into the global economy. And the ways that it plugs into it is often enormously disadvantageous to those national economies. And that in and of itself can also drive inequality. So what we've seen, for example, in the African context is that a lot of African countries in sub-Saharan Africa are trying to industrialize at the moment that the global economy is driven by the services sectors and by financialization. And so they don't have the tools available that Southeast Asia had 20 years ago, 25 years ago to industrialize. So what you have is a massively youthful labor market, but no industrial jobs. And so, of course, if the only jobs that are growing was in the services sector, inequality is going to widen as well, particularly in terms of wages and income inequality. So that's a little bit of a long prelude, but it's important to understand that you cannot always reduce the drivers of inequality to intra-urban process. There's broader forces at play. What can be done if the poor are just surviving? And how does one put this on the agenda? So I come back to my opening remarks that, of course, in this case, it is really important to have alliances between movements of the urban poor and intermediary organizations like think tanks and particularly the media to at least shine a light on the trends of inequality. Usually in most of our sectors, the data is available, but the data doesn't get packaged in a way that you can communicate that effectively to show what the nature of inequality is. In other words, it is possible to foreground inequality even though the urban poor may be completely preoccupied with survival. Again, the issue is how does one build coalitions between movements of the urban poor, NGOs who work with data, and people in the media space, and people who can help to visualize data in a way that it becomes stark that inequality is indeed a problem. Thanks.
Thanks, Edgar. So we have an interesting question coming in from Lewis from the live chat. So for Johannesburg, corridors of freedom appear as a specific strategy for a profound spatial and socio-economic exclusion. In your experience, can this be a valid approach to other situations?
So I'm not, thanks. I'm not too sure how familiar people are with the corridors of freedom intervention. So I'll give a very, I've done research on this for a couple of years, so I'm going to have a tendency to overtalk it. So I'm going to try and be extremely brief. Essentially, in South African cities, which in some ways is the case study or the paradigm for racialized inequality, what you have is that the poor are at the outskirts of the city, the middle class and the elites are at the other extreme of the city, and in between you've got the old core of the city where the old economy used to operate. And so one of the critical political priorities was to figure out how does one create a mechanism that can attract public finance, crowd in private finance, to create new economic activity and residential life, to connect these different pockets of the city. And that was the corridors of freedom. Now, the jury is still out whether that intervention is working. It is work in progress. But what I can say, and what is interesting from that work, is that the idea that you do spatial planning as a mechanism to intervene in land markets and crowd in both public and private resources to get other forms of urban dynamism going is absolutely valid, and I can see that applying in most contexts. And in fact, I would argue even more that if we think of the idea that you tend to, through this notion of radical incrementalism that you'd have been exposed to, that you tend to get momentum for a different kind of change in the city through key catalytic projects, these kinds of interventions are really important, because what they do is they demonstrate to the whole city and particularly to investors the intent of how to intervene in land markets and how to effect spatial transformation. And as a mechanism that can combine land use planning, integrated public transport planning, and also new forms of residential coexistence, you're able to, over the medium to long term, really effect structural change in the space economy of the city. And I don't think it's unique to Johannesburg. I see a lot of cities, because of the nature of global real estate markets, that suffer from the same spatial inequality, and this can definitely be adapted to other contexts. Thanks.
So we have a question which is a follow-up from the discussion forum. McCall asks that although participative democracy is an interesting concept, it certainly has weaknesses. It doesn't work if any of the interested parties are absent, especially those in positions of authority. So and there's also the danger of reaching an agreement in principle, but then not going through with the implementation or enforcement. So how does one hold these governments accountable?
Thanks. Yeah, so I think that this, of course, is the perennial problem, is that you can expend an enormous amount of energy and resources in these formalized participatory processes, but they always run the risk of being simply symbolic or being performative. In other words, they're theater. So they're not something that is really meant to impact on the day-to-day decision-making and running of the public authority. They're more there as a showcase that politicians use to gain political capital. We are consulting, we want to engage, but actually decision-making happens somewhere else. It is precisely for this reason that I can't overstate enough the importance of transparency and accountability, as I alluded to earlier. And I think we're in a very interesting time where we've seen a proliferation of social media tools and apps that can really take accountability and transparency to the next level. So I think really embracing the open source movements that is now proliferated around the world, thinking about subsidized mechanisms for citizens to give feedback and response on service delivery, bureaucratic practices, whistleblowing activities, and so forth. I think one can dramatically raise the accountability atmosphere in different cities. And again, you know, because these platforms can so easily be adapted to different contexts and different cultures, we can really short circuit the learning process that's required to introduce these things. But again, it has to be seen as part of a repertoire of different mechanisms to effect accountability and transparency. I'm not saying that that's the solution, but I think that that's an important part of a larger package of mechanisms to ensure that. So yes, it's true that participation can be shallow, that it can be more symbolic and performative, but I don't think that one should therefore throw the baby out with the bathwater. It's important to retain that, but at the same time, deepen accountability and transparency so that those processes become more substantive over time.
That's the way I hope. Thanks for that, Edgar. So the questions are coming in thick and fast from the live chat. Narendra Yash is asking whether, with civil society institutions like trade unions gradually getting politicized in a country like India, how does one envisage socio and economic movement seeking radical reforms?
So I assume from that question that trade unions are seen as conservative and against radical and social reform. So I have no knowledge of the trade union movement in India, so I can't comment directly, but I can use it to make a broader point. So, and again, maybe it's a good moment to return to one of the pillars of our discussion today, which is the Sustainable Development Goals. Now, we know that the future of work is under threat, or there's a huge question mark that hovers above the future of work and the changing nature of the labor market. And that, of course, goes to the heart of the identity of trade unions. We also know that wages of people at the lower end of the middle spectrum and at the lower end of the income spectrum is under enormous pressure, and that across both OECD countries and lower income countries, we've seen a flatlining of wages at the lower end of the spectrum. And again, that's the natural constituency of trade unions. Although, because the labor market has bifurcated, certainly in the African context, the majority of the labor force is actually caught up in informal work or in what the ILO calls vulnerable employment, and they're not part of the trade union sector. And often we see a tension between the, if you will, worker interests of the poorest of the poor and organized workers. So for that reason, it is often the case that trade unions can fall into the trap of opposing deep socioeconomic transformation in society. My response would be that it is important for other domains of civil society to also organize, not just sectorally, but to build coalitions for change. And at the level of coalitions, it is possible then to establish dialogue between social movements, between non-profit entities and think tanks and the trade union movement, and try and forge some kind of discussion about what everyone can agree would constitute transformative change and what would be in the domain of sectoral interests. Now, you will never resolve those debates, but if you don't have the discussion, it is almost impossible to come to some kind of joint understanding. And why is joint understanding important? Because there are certain issues. Let's take the environmental question, for example, or let's take questions around access to water and safe sanitation. These are the kinds of questions that you can build a societal consensus around, even with the middle class. But unless you've got mechanisms for organized formations in a city or a society to talk to each other and to try and have a view about the larger questions, you cannot come up with those strategic areas of overlap where there's shared interest or where you can build a shared perspective. So I would say in this case, a dialogue is crucial. Secondly, civil society has to aggregate and organize itself at a coalition scale and not just sectorally, and that there's got to be some intermediation to facilitate the tough political discussions that's required. Thanks.
Yeah, so we have another question from the live chat. Yasin asks, how can development help shape a better city identity among the people who live there?
Sorry, can you just repeat, please?
Sure, yeah. So how can development help shape a better city-oriented identity among the citizens of in the city, residents of the city?
Yeah. Thanks. That connects also with one of the questions that came through that was prepared beforehand. So I think a thematic, and I think this is really important because it goes to the heart of how does one think about urban politics and democracy where identity is mobilized politically to divide people and to divide the urban poor. And one of the other questions referred to this idea that yes, you can organize people, but during elections, political parties ramp up, sort of caste or ethnic or racial identities, and they use that as a tool, which cuts across this idea of a city-oriented identity. These are, of course, incredibly complex and difficult discussions, but I think it helps us to reflect on an important theme that is often underemphasized in the broader discussion around democracy and urban politics and urban transformation. And that's the issue of cultural identity and how we use cultural mobilization as a mechanism of forging what one could call an urban identity, right? So, of course, so why does culture matter? Very briefly, one is a lot of participatory process, if we're honest with ourselves, is incredibly boring. Right? I mean, they are just dull. So people have to go to these meetings where people talk endlessly, very few decisions get made, and it kind of assumes a certain availability of time, which is not a reality for most poor people. Secondly, we now know in an era of passion-driven politics, which the right wing has mobilized effectively, is that if you're not able to connect with people emotionally, in terms of what really matters to them, in terms of their religious, their cultural, and their political and linguistic identities, then you're never really going to enroll people into your projects. And for too long, we've assumed that some moral, if you will, appeal to issues of human rights or social justice is sufficient. And we now know that's not the case, that we have to engage with people at a level that they feel their personal passions are in some ways understood and enrolled and engaged. And I think we've got a rich, rich repertoire of tools within the cultural planning, cultural mobilization domain that we can begin to think of more creatively to get people to, one, rethink their identity in relation to their community, their neighborhood differently, to figure out how they can project themselves and their aspirations in public spaces within their communities, how their cultural institutions, whether it is in music, whether it's in dance, whether it's in performance, in various religious manifestations, can also have a voice within broader debates in the city and how those mechanisms can happen. I think once we become a lot more comfortable and adept at using culture and the arts and sports as ways in which citizens can be enrolled around everyday spaces and everyday concerns, it's only then that we can begin to break the back of primordial identities and that we can build, if you will, a true citizenship in the sense of that being a sense of who I am and a sense of identity. And I think that that's where a lot more work and a lot more research and a lot more experimentation has to happen. But it does mean we've got to trust young people to play a much stronger leadership role in reanimating urban politics than has been the case to date. Thanks.
Thanks, Edgar. So that's never been more relevant in the context of the ongoing developments in the UK right now. So staying with the theme of referendums, Francisco has this question about the Symbolico referendum, which has polarized Colombia. Francisco wonders, how can one protect peace and transformation and protect and foster discussions out of the constitution, which is manipulated by unreliable representatives?
Yeah, I mean, that's a near impossible question to answer. It's more in the domain of that's a very profound existential question. But I'll dumb it down a little bit and respond in a more direct way. So I think from, as you correctly pointed out, what's happening in the UK at the moment and the crisis around Brexit and various other processes, this idea that that referenda, or kind of the people, the people's voice in a way is represented by referenda. We of course now know, especially in an age of internet-based manipulation of opinion, the way in which social media platforms have been used to manipulate opinion and sentiment and to mobilize them, that there's no way one can assume that a referenda gives you a representative outcome, right? There's just too much intermediation that happens from these external forces that can manipulate and shape opinion. So the question then is, how does one strengthen the instruments of representative democracy alongside deepening citizen engagement? And I think that these two have to go in tandem, that we've got to get a better class of politician, and we're only going to get a better class of politician if we get more young people involved. And secondly, if the accountability mechanisms are stronger, right? And so I think that what we've seen is that there's such a disenchantment with formal political processes that politicians, if you will, they kind of become, they're in a bubble and they become a law to themselves. Secondly, we can never underestimate the potential of an organized citizenry, right? Now, there's nothing inbuilt in that says you're going to get progressive change, but I think it is a risk worthwhile taking. And one has to assume that over time, that as questions of distributive justice and as questions of restorative justice in the case of Colombia, where you've had a violent conflict like you've had in South Africa and many other places, it is really important for ordinary citizens to be involved in the work of rebuilding a civic identity and a civic culture that takes cognizance of those histories, but is able to use that as a resource to build a more forward-looking, future-oriented identity. And so, yes, I think that, many examples around the world, whether it's Brexit, whether it's the Colombian case, whether it is process happening in the Philippines or in Venezuela or in the US for that matter, we know that we live in times in which public sentiment is mobilized in profound ways. But that should just be an encouragement to really focus on getting the core elements of a democratic polity to be as good as it can be. Representative democracy with its participatory attachments and building citizenship through effective organizations that can work both thematically and that can work in a coalition format. That's the only way in which one will be able to build over the long term a more inclusive and democratic collective public sentiment.
Last question, the one that I just posted.
Yeah, so staying with so Thomas in the US, so he's staying with the theme of public sentiment swaying decisions. There's an ongoing discussion in the US about government reparations for African Americans as a result of the legacy of slavery. Are there any successful examples that you can cite from around the world?
To deal with the reparations, or to deal with, sorry, I didn't get the whole question. Can you just restate it, please?
Well, Thomas asked that in the US, there's a conversation about government reparations for African Americans as a result of slavery. So are there examples that you can cite around the world?
No, not offhand, and that doesn't mean they aren't. It's just that, you know, this is not something that I have deep knowledge of. But I think the question of reparations and there's sort of a broader issue here, and that is, how does one have a public dialogue, a public conversation, a democratic conversation about the long-term intergenerational legacies of you know, sort of profound social, political, economic projects like colonialism and so forth. And so what is interesting is in parallel to the debates in the US about reparations, there's been this really powerful discussion in a European context about African cultural and artistic artifacts in European museums and the importance of returning that. And a very significant intellectual from Senegal, Phil Winfa, has been leading a commission that was set up by Macron around this question. And there's now this really substantial shift that has happened in the last few years, that there's indeed a political and moral obligation on European institutions to return African art and artifacts. But there's been an interesting debate around that what is maybe even more important, maybe not as lucrative, but more important is the archives, is the colonial archives, is that if one can think about returning the colonial archives that are still embargoed in most parts of the global north, that would be far more profound in people in the global south being able to understand the scale and the systematic nature of the colonial project and the potential for restoration and for understanding this, if you will, long night that we are living through over the last 3-4 centuries is much greater by interrogating those archives of colonial records than it is of just having cultural artifacts returned and you kind of have a cultural festival about how wonderful it is to have our masks or our artworks or whatever back. So I think there's something in that which is important to reflect on when we think about the reparations case. My understanding has always been that the campaign in the US for reparations has been less about what the financial aspects of that might be, but rather the societal acknowledgement that a deep wound is at the heart of the identity of American society and economy. And that unless that wound is addressed, is acknowledged, is engaged with through some form of open declaration that historical injustice and violence is at the core of the contemporary society and privilege, you're never going to move forward in terms of race relations or in terms of social justice in the US. So in other words, reparations is in fact a device to have a more profound conversation. And I think that in that sense, we are seeing a very important moment around the world where a discussion about what decoloniality might mean in science, what decoloniality might mean in contemporary art, etc., is that exact same process of trying to get to the core of this institutional wound that structures contemporary globalization process, to be honest, to be frank. And I think that for me is what is exciting about this time, because it is because it is coinciding with the recognition that contemporary extractive capitalism is obsolete, that it has run its course, that we need a different economic model and a different way of thinking into the future in the context of climate change impacts and in the context of automation, AI, and so forth. There's this interesting nexus of recognizing that we are in fact busy with a civilizational discussion, with what does it mean to be a species amongst others in a finite world where we need to radically rethink what we value and what our economic system should value and what labor is and what it means to be an active citizen in that society. And these are, of course, big questions, but they cannot be had as technological fantasies. They have to be had with a strong historical anchoring as to what structured where we are today and the way in which the planet is pillaged. Thanks.
Thanks, Edgar. That reminds me of the time when somebody described the British Museum as the world's longest running active crime scene. So moving on from that. So we have had a couple of questions, one from the live chat, which is very similar to one from the discussion forum as well. So asks whether it does not matter how governance, planners, and architects are involved in the process of improving the city if the community is apathetic, indifferent, and takes care only of the problems affecting them directly. So how would one encourage residents to actively participate, and how can education inculcate in a society that participation is worthwhile?
Yeah, that's a great question. Absolutely crucial. So I think that what is striking is if we look, so we've been, I would say, when Rio happened in 1991, the environmental summit, Local Agenda 21 was introduced as an idea, and this was very important because that 1990s marked the beginning of the end of neoliberalism as we knew it. Of course, as an institutional economic force, it remains very powerful, but as an ideological construct, it started to be undone from that moment onwards. And what was then echoed later on in other UN summits and then in Habitat 2 in 1996 in Istanbul was, of course, decentralization is important, and democratic decentralization linked to fiscal empowerment of local authorities. And we're sort of still living through this process of trying to translate those policy ideals into institutional practices. And in fact, in most parts of the developing world, we know that democratic decentralization has not yet been fully institutionalized, and that remains an ongoing struggle. So you've had that, if you will, institutional discussion alongside the acceptance of participatory local development as a norm. So we talk about participation as an obvious good. What we didn't have, what was kind of missed in those processes, was the importance of civic education, right? And so if you think of it, the amount of resources that have been poured into training local government officers, into building local institutions, into understanding what participatory development means, we've paid almost no attention to figure out an institutional mechanism where ordinary citizens can come together from different sectors and in a collective thinking about their neighborhood or about the city in an integrated way, learn what the tools and techniques of effective organization and citizenship might be. So we've just not had it. So I think that it is completely unrealistic to expect that these new local authorities that have been introduced, these new mechanisms for participation, are going to be optimized if we don't make the investment into ordinary citizens, knowing what it means to organize and to hold public authorities accountable, but moreover, to direct their own local development, right? So that's sort of one substantive issue that I wanted to put forward. But I think that it is also important to see the enrollment in service delivery processes, especially in very poor municipalities and poor cities, as potentially not just a cost-saving mechanism or a way of getting services more quickly to people, but as in and of itself, a process of civic participation, right? Because what you can do is you can really build a sense of ownership that you can then connect to resource allocation. And one of the key mechanisms that have worked in particularly the Latin American context is to give discretionary funding to citizens who are organized so that they can prioritize how to invest in their neighborhoods, not just in the slum upgrading project, but in the civic infrastructure that's around that. And it's that dual activity, being involved in your own upgrading process, but also collectively investing in and maintaining the collective infrastructure and spaces, that I believe one gets to a different kind of understanding of citizenship and holding the municipality account. And finally, if that happens, then people say, oh, okay, let's say we get, $1,000 a month for public infrastructure in our neighborhood, but why are we getting 1,000, and how does that relate to what gets spent in another part of the city? And that relational understanding of how the city works, where funding goes, etc., is a key sort of, it's a tipping point in the understanding of citizens about how power works in their city. So I think that there are, that even when, if you will, communities seem apathetic or participatory processes don't work too well, that we can think harder about how to institutionalize mechanisms for civic education that can lead to more effective processes. Thanks.
Okay, so we have another question from the discussion forum. So Naveen asks, he alludes to your lecture in the module and says that it gave him a very clear picture of how things seem to move along in big cities in India. So it seems that we constantly need radical incrementalism to get the people in power to wake up from their corrupt, laissez-faire ways. Do we have to be radical Democrats if we want our voice to be heard and move away from the money-making mindset of infrastructure development? Quite a loaded question.
Yeah, so in the lecture, I, of course, drew attention to the distinction between radical democracy and deliberative democracy. Now, this, of course, is a long-standing debate in political theory and in planning studies, and sometimes they pit it against each other too strongly. So I like to think of the two as almost entangled, and to recognize that the critique that deliberation in and of itself can give you the best possible outcome is absolutely valid, and I'm convinced by that, and I've written on that. On the other hand, to think that one only surfaces conflicts in society, and that is the primary driver of democratic innovation in the society, is to, I think, miss a lot of cultural nuance about societies in the global south. So I think that it is important to have ways of surfacing conflicts and structural conflicts, but at the same time, you need moments of agreement. You need moments of saying, yes, this is something that we can move forward on collectively, even though we still disagree about that and that. And the participants in the MOOC may want to remember that one of the slides that I referred to in the talk, in the lecture, is about different kinds of conflict, and to be able to differentiate between that. I want to sort of just remind them of that. So to come back to the question, I think that in contexts where there's a high level of corruption, that obviously one then tilts in the direction of direct, if you will, engagement to expose those practices, to make sure that various transparency mechanisms work to their best, that one enrolls and mobilizes media to make that visible, but at the same time, to find examples, if you will, of potentially good practice. right? Because for me, what we've got to understand, that critique for its own sake will never get you anywhere. That if you're in the business of wanting to build a more democratic city, a more inclusive city, you've got to work with what you've got, right? So there's kind of got to be a certain realism, a certain pragmatism about how change comes about. Now, I would be very surprised that even in highly captured cities with very efficient, sort of patronage-driven machines and networks and so forth, that you won't find any examples of bureaucrats trying to do the right thing, or of certain partnerships between a community and officials trying to innovate at the edges of the system. And in those cases, I think it is important to find those, to identify those, to support them and amplify them. Not simply, and obviously not to expose them to the extent that they get victimized or they get taken out or wiped out, but in a way that you can at least in your criticism point to a viable alternative to do things differently. But if you don't have, if that doesn't happen, and this again comes back to my original point about relationality, if you don't do that in relation to also exposing the rot and the corruption in a relentless fashion, then I think you're not going to make a lot of inroads. But you've got to connect those two things up so that you're making an argument about what's unacceptable, but you're also demonstrating what the direction might be to do things differently, and that you've got local green shoots that are potentially that into the future. Thanks.
So we have a question from the live chat. Balaji asks about what is the role of design professionals such as architects and urban designers in transforming in current urban development dynamics? Are there any interesting examples of engagement that you could provide?
Yeah, so I think they're crucial because one of the things is if we think of some practical ways in which we can think in a more sort of deeper fashion about what citizenship might mean, what these civic education mechanisms might impart at the level of skills, one can identify, I would say, if citizen groups want to be really effective, they've got to have budget literacy. They've got to understand how the finances work, where the pressure points are, what the distributional logics are, et cetera, so that they can be strategic and focused in their campaigns. Secondly, they've got to have spatial literacy. They've got to understand what is the sort of larger metropolitan scale spatial framework. Within that logic, where does our neighborhood sit? And how is our neighborhood read by the spatial plan? And what does that mean for programming, for investments, for infrastructure, and so forth? But secondly, also, how do we think about the spatial relationships at the intimacy of our neighborhood? So how many pressures do we have? What public spaces do we have? How does that relate to the market? Where does public transport happen? And how can we optimize those relationships spatially so that we have a thriving, livable, safe, healthy community, right? And you need some sense of space and so on. But of course, the real tools to understand that isn't planning, it is design, right? So if you think about the criteria of good design in a typical sort of developing country context, it would be functionality, that the response of the solution makes sense, it responds to a real need. It would be safety, I would argue. So a lot of the poorest communities in the world live in incredibly precarious circumstances where they are always unsafe, whether it is to police corruption or bribery or extortion or environmental elements, they're on landslides or whatever. And a third criteria for good design is affordability, so that whatever you come up as a solution has got to be affordable within the livelihood logics of the community that's there. And fourthly, lastly, is aesthetics, is a sense of beauty, is a sense of cultural resonance for the community. Now, if citizens are empowered to apply those 4 design criteria in these participatory processes, whether it is slum upgrading, whether it's a public space, whether it's a cultural facility, whatever, and they have the broader spatial understanding and budget literacy, then you get to a point where civic groups have a deep analysis and they've got some provocations that are meaningful and that speaks back to power in a way that power can understand. Now, for me, there is no way a designer can understand those elements of good design without working intimately and closely with local communities. And if those local communities aren't organized, their first job has got to be part of the process of helping those communities to organize themselves more effectively and more democratically, and to also be part of that learning process, right? So for me, I think that design professionals have a critical role to play, especially when we understand the integrated nature of neighborhood and city development. Secondly, they can really build a bridge whilst people build these different literacies between formal planning and community aspirations and desires. And thirdly, I think that they can drive genuine innovation if they're willing to work in a collaborative way, in a co-producing way with the community members. So as you can see, I'm a fan of designers, but I think that they've got to obviously, I think they have to be willing to cede a lot of power and a lot of authority at the neighborhood scale. Thanks.
Thanks, Edgar. So we have time for just about the last question of the evening. So this is in the theme of fiscal autonomy of the cities. So Mugda asks from the live chat, she asked that one of the biggest challenges today facing city governments is the huge mismatch between increasing responsibility of these bodies and the limited resources they have to work with. So would you know of any examples where city governments have come up with innovative approaches to raise finances and develop fiscal autonomy?
Yeah, this is, I mean, this is the big question, right? So I'll give you one example, which is telling. So Dakar in Senegal had a very forward-looking mayor and sort of very globally engaged mayor, and they sort of made Dakar part of C40 and so on. And one of the instruments that he developed was a green bond for Dakar. And when the bond was launched, what was it, maybe 3, 4, 5 years ago, the day after the intention to launch the bond was announced, it was oversubscribed 5 times, right? That was the market response. So there was a real appetite for this. The day the bond was to be announced, the president basically issued a decree to ban the municipality from issuing the bond. 2 years later, the mayor was in jail, and he's still in jail today, because he was seen by the recently re-elected President Macky Sall as a potential contender for the presidential position. So I kind of tell the story to say that there are some interesting debates, especially in the context of new sources of finance through the climate change agenda that have come onto the stage. There's a lot of interesting discussions about alternative mechanisms to raise revenue. But the binding constraint we face in most places is that we have not really seen deep fiscal decentralization and devolution with fiscal powers in most contexts in the global south. So unless that, if you will, national political question, institutional question shifts, it's going to be very hard for us to innovate. Where we do have more decentralized systems, what we've mainly seen as innovations is in the environmental space. There, the problem is that most of the global funds that have been established through the development finance system still operate on the assumption that you can only channel financing through national governments. So even if cities' balance sheets allow them to access funding, they cannot receive the funding because of the international regulations that nation states should be the port of call for funding. And so that's sort of a second obstacle. The last point I want to make around this is that at the moment, I would say if you take the least developed countries in the world and a whole bunch of lower middle income countries in the world, in terms of the status quo and how development financing systems are designed and structured, they will never reach those countries. So in practice, most of these cities and towns are not bankable in the language of development finance. So what we need in terms of the poorest cities and towns in the world is we need a new architecture for development finance. Now, that process has been recognized by UCLG. That's the global body that represents local authorities in the world. They've got a task team underway now, as far as I understand, that is trying to figure out what this architecture might be. In the meantime, new platforms have emerged, the most significant of which is the C40 Climate Finance Platform, where they are creating mechanisms to help cities to produce better quality projects so that they can attract finance. So in other words, they're responding to what is considered a glut in the global financial system, where you've got about $100 trillion sloshing around looking for good projects, and massive large-scale need around the world, but a lack of capacity to get proposals project ready so that they can. So they're trying to deal with that specific institutional bottleneck. I think that's very important and very significant work, but there is a deeper issue here that the architecture of the global financing system in and of itself is profoundly flawed in terms of its criteria of risk and who it will lend to and who it won't lend to. So that doesn't answer the question directly, President, but hopefully that can help the student to at least begin to think into the issue. Thanks.
Thanks for that, Edgar. So we are seeing a lot of messages coming in on the live chat, messages of gratitude for your time here. So thank you for all your insights and the great answers. Thank you. And to our viewers on the live chat, so thank you for tuning in and for all your engaging questions as well. If you have further questions that you'd like to discuss, we encourage you to post them on the discussion forum to start dialogue with your peers. You could also write in to us at cities@sdgacademy.org for any queries or clarifications. You can find a recording of this webinar under the weekly webinar tab of Module 8. The date for the next webinar will be released shortly on the forum. Once again, thank you for your active participation, and we'll see you again next week. So have a good evening, everyone.